Hey, hey, this is your girl Rashida Green, and you are listening to the Crossroads podcast, a show for and about environmental justice and those who fight the fight with skin as melanated as the days are long. Knowledge is power, and we're breaking down stereotypes one episode at a time. Let's start the show. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Crossroads. This episode, I hooked up with Dr. Adonia Lugo to discuss her work with mobility justice in LA. She's the author of Bicycle Race, Transportation, Culture, and Resistance. This book is a discussion about class and race from a transportation perspective. During this interview, we hit on a lot of topics related to both, and also bicycle culture and how infrastructure for cycling doesn't always meet the needs of the entire community. Get a notebook or stay by your phone because Adonia drops some jewels about mobility justice and the prominent Black leaders and organizations committed to the movement. Adonia, thank you so much for joining me.
Rashida, it is great to be here. Thanks for having me.
No problem. Okay, so talk to me about your origin story.
Yeah, right. So I'm someone who was born and raised in Southern California, and I'm from a family that, talked about race a lot. It was just in our ongoing dialogue when I was growing up because we're a mixed race family. My mom is white. Her ancestors moved here as settlers from Europe in the late 19th century, and my dad is a Mexican immigrant. And so when I was growing up in South Orange County, a place that continues to be pretty segregated and has a really strong history of right wing politics, it just was so like we stood out as not really fitting in because we weren't on the white side and we weren't fully on the Mexican side, but the neighborhood where I grew up was mostly Mexican immigrant families. So these are just, things that we talked about in our family as I was growing up: segregation, white flight, and those kinds of things. And then when I started graduate school and was thinking about looking at public spaces and how people were interacting in public spaces in Southern California, it just became so obvious that that whole issue around how we treat each other and race and class, all that stuff really gets expressed in our roadways. We really bring that with us. There's like so much of a power struggle that's happening as we're just commuting or getting from one place to another. And so I ended up doing my anthropology PhD dissertation about the intersections of race and class and transportation in Southern California. And I was primarily involved in bicycle promotion projects, so doing things that had to do with, trying to see how to create culturally relevant events around bicycling and making a connection between people who use bicycles for transportation as a low cost, mobility option, and the people who promote bicycling as professional advocates who typically, are white, middle class, people who actually have some choices about how they're getting around. So I was really interested in figuring out how to create more of a sense of community between the different types of bicycle users out there. And then after I finished my PhD, I ended up getting to move to Washington, D.C. to work for the League of American Bicyclists in 2013. And they are the country's oldest bicycle advocacy organization. They've been around in one form or another since 1880. And I was hired to lead an equity initiative because by that time, 2013, there were enough people around the country who were recognizing those same kinds of gaps that I had been studying in my dissertation project that, seemed like maybe this whole segregated society thing was playing out even in our movements that were supposed to be getting us all toward more sustainable living, like, sustainable transportation, biking, walking, and all that. We needed to also look at how um, the legacies of inequity and who we were comfortable spending time with, power dynamics, all that kind of stuff was playing out in those spaces as well. And so I worked in DC for about 18 months and ended up leaving the organization I was working for because at the same time that people were recognizing that there were these gaps and there was a need to address equity within the bike world, there was also a lot of resistance to that. And it came through as, just making people like me feel unwelcome. So I decided to leave working in that space, but I was still really interested in promoting sustainable transportation, talking about race and how it relates to the ways we get around and our street cultures and all these other things that are happening when we're out there in the street, besides whether, you're on a bicycle or walking or in a car. Because the way that the field of transportation planning and engineering approaches transportation is very much about what mode you're on, like mode share, how many people are walking, how many people are biking, how many people are in cars, how many people are in transit. And what I could see from years of talking to folks and doing observation and obviously being a street user myself is that there's more going on. There are other things that make us feel safe or unsafe besides how it is that we're traveling. Who we are in our bodies is
Right.
something you can't really, you can't step outside of that the way you step outside of a car or, So, so yeah, by the time I decided I didn't want to work in bicycle advocacy anymore, there was actually a growing number of people who were people of color, women, queer folks, people who just had similarly had the experience that, it just, we wanted to be making mobility more sustainable and safer, but we were not finding our ideas welcome in the organizations that said they were, trying to do that stuff. So in 2016, a group of us came together for an event we called the Untokening because we were tired of tokenism and we wanted to get past, being those token voices. And it was really at the Untokening where we started talking about this concept of mobility justice. And building on the legacy of transportation justice, which really is an offshoot of the whole environmental justice conversation. And so mobility justice for us has become a place to flesh out advocacy, not only around making sure that our community members are safe from the violence of car crashes and that sort of threat in the street, but also how can we be taking into account the vulnerability that that Black folks are experiencing simply by looking the way they do and because we have the police systems that we do. What about the vulnerability that people who are immigrants are experiencing because of the hostile legal and government environment that's being created for them? What about women and trans folks who just have to deal with gender-based harassment on a regular basis? So in mobility justice, we want to be moving toward creating public spaces where as we move, we can actually feel safe, and we includes many more people than were being taken into account in the past, and the kinds of safety that we are looking at are broader. So I wouldn't have guessed when I started noticing that it seemed like there was some kind of connection going on between race and class and transportation. I wouldn't have guessed that, there was a need to actually help bring a new understanding of what that problem was into the world. But it's been amazing the last decade getting to get to know people all over the country and help to create this conversation.
So you gave us a lot. So I want to no, but it was great because it's definitely like very apropos to what we're going to be talking about. Take me back a little bit, like historically in LA, or it can be the city where you grew up in. What were some very historic, pivotal moments that contributed to the issues that we're seeing that you can obviously attest to specifically in LA and California, but just in general. What are some of the moments where it became very clear that there was a clear connection between race, class, and transportation?
Hmm. Yeah, I would say one of the things that sticks out for me with like an early memory of bicycling, like I've heard from lots of people who had this, great experience with bicycling when they were kids, where it was this passport to freedom and they could get all over their neighborhood, and it was, such a cool thing. I didn't have that experience. Where I grew up, it wasn't considered safe for me to go out and ride my bike around, and so, I could like ride it in the alley, and that was pretty much it. And then, like one time, maybe we did it more than once, but you know how, I don't know, memory gets distorted. I remember one time my older sister and I rode our bikes from our neighborhood into town, like to a drugstore. Um, and we left the bikes outside the drugstore without a lock. I mean, I don't think we had anybody in the family had a bike lock.
Mm-hmm.
And somebody stole her bike. So, then we couldn't ride our bikes into town anymore. And then a while later, maybe it was like a week or something, my mom and I saw this guy on her bike.
Oh,
It was a
it's like a
distinctive
girl's
bike.
bike.
Yeah, it was like a cruiser, kind of like a beach cruiser with one of
Okay.
those like big colorful seats. And it was a Latino man, and we yelled like, "Hey!" And he just like whoosh, beat it out of there as fast as he could. And so like as an adult looking back on that, I'm like, dang, what is going on in your life that you have to steal a kid's bike?
Yeah.
Like that to me is an indicator of the kind of pressures that people in my neighborhood were living with. And so it's a different kind of biking as a kid story than a lot of what I've heard. And I mean, something that was really pivotal for me that I write about in my book that is based on my dissertation is when I came back to Southern California for graduate school in 2007. I had started being a bicycle commuter living up in Portland, Oregon, and up there it's like bikey town. Everybody's biking around. And so I hadn't really thought about it too much, like, oh yeah, riding a bike, that makes sense. And then coming back to live in Southern California, it's like I'd forgotten about the car culture or something. Like I hadn't thought about how different it was going to feel to ride my bicycle here. So as I was, trying to just do that same kind of bike commuting I'd done in Portland, it felt so scary. And, that's what made me really think about, dang, what is going on? Why are people honking at me or swerving around? Aren't I doing the thing that we're supposed to do? And that's when I really started to make a connection between bicycling and climate change. And, this thing that I had just kind of started doing because kind of thought it was cool, or really, honestly, my boyfriend thought it was cool. That's why I started bike commuting. Once I came back to Southern California and was experiencing our annual wildfires and was just seeing the really unfortunate lack of stewardship that we really abuse our beautiful landscape that we have here. It just kind of all clicked together, and I was like, this is a good thing to do for the planet. Riding my bicycle is like a nice little, way that I can cut back on my carbon footprint. But people are being so nasty to me, so it doesn't really feel good to do it if people are going to be, um, all nasty to me. So I was like thinking about that stuff, and then in the fall of 2007, I read a newspaper article that really just kind of like stopped me in my tracks about how there had been this man riding a bicycle home to my hometown, San Juan Capistrano, from the neighboring town, and he, I guess, had been a busboy at a local diner, and he was riding home at 3 o'clock in the morning, something like that, on a sidewalk. He wasn't even riding in the roadway, and a drunk driver hit him, and he died.
Yeah.
And just reading the story and having was I was going through the same, like, feeling vulnerable on a bicycle and wondering about it, and just so this guy who was a Mexican immigrant, um, it just was like, this is something's wrong here. Something's wrong. Like, why are people who are like just trying to stay out of the way? Like, someone's riding his bike on the sidewalk in the middle of the night. You would think he's not in anybody's way, and yet somehow he's not safe. Like, that's so just that was another um, moment where I just felt like there was something that needed to be unpacked, and some complexity dug into. And yeah, I mean, one other, like, non-bike related piece is, I remember when I was a teenager, I was super embarrassed about riding the bus. Um,
Me too.
yeah, like, just felt really embarrassed. And at the time, I didn't, yeah, I didn't question it. You're a teenager. You're like, oh, I don't want to do the thing that makes me
It's
look
not
not
cool.
cool. Yeah, like, I just look like a loser waiting on the corner. And so that was something, once I, again, had gone up and drunk the Kool-Aid in Portland, everybody rides the bus there, whatever, and came back, um, and realized, like, oh, that whole not wanting to ride the bus thing, that was me internalizing, like, there's something wrong with you if you're not driving a car. And that,
Hmm.
that's so strongly our culture here. It's like,
Yes, it is.
if you can't afford to drive, well, it means things aren't going good in your life. And the second you can,
You
you
should.
you should. Yeah.
You should. And just like kind of getting back into some of the, because you're talking about people for mobility justice, and they actually gave a really great presentation at Antioch. And a couple of things that they noted as far as patterns are concerned for what usually happens as far as transportation is that it's, that the neighborhoods that are most affected are communities of color. And it's
Hmm.
usually through health and safety, limits on mobility, state violence and criminalization, lack of community engagement, and displacement. So when these decisions are being made for people, about where something is going to go, like a freeway, for instance, or any type of public transportation, there is never really consultation with the folks that are currently residing in the community. It's always
Hmm.
something that's from outside sources. So, you know, can you talk a little more about some of the other groups that you're involved in and some of the advocacy work that you're having to do around these issues?
Yeah, so yeah, absolutely. We're dealing with the legacy in this country of so many decades of planning either without considering local communities at all, or planning on the behalf of people who don't actually get to play a meaningful role in deciding where investment is going and what it looks like. And so, with transportation, what has been really challenging in that space and trying to change that pattern is, um, people who care a lot about sustainability and trying to combat climate change and all that, you usually are operating with a good bit of urgency. And I mean, that's absolutely the people who get motivated to work in bicycle advocacy, or in, trying to make our transportation systems more sustainable. They've got this sense of, like, we need to make these changes now. And so that actually makes them less open to collaboration with local community members than would be ideal. And so the groups that I'm part of are increasingly trying to shift so that we can actually go to a model like that, where instead of the idea of promoting active transportation or sustainable mobility, meaning that a neighborhood needs to get that street infrastructure, um, what if we set up more community mobility spaces? What if we created more kinds of jobs for people, that tied them into sustainable mobility? Because in my experience, a really good way to get people on board with what you're doing is to pay them. And
Yes.
you know what I mean? Like, also, kind of an important issue in struggling communities is frickin' where are the good jobs, right?
Right.
So instead of saying, okay, you're a disadvantaged community, so what you need to make your street safer is to have an outside planning firm get a bunch of your tax dollars to design a roadway for you. And we'll have some meetings that you can come to and
At
have
6 o'clock.
I have some superficial input. Hey, maybe we'll even give you like $100 stipend. And again, this would be like a project where a planning firm is getting a contract for $50,000 or $100,000 of our, tax dollars. So at People for Mobility Justice and the Untokening Network and some of the different bicycle worker-owned cooperatives that have formed around the country. We're really trying to figure out how can we get those taxpayer dollars to support sustainable mobility spent in local neighborhoods in a way that doesn't just have that funding going toward a certain kind of professional or a certain kind of firm that is most likely not employing people who live in our low income communities and in our, historically disadvantaged neighborhoods. So basically, we're trying to like create some new career tracks where you could become the owner of a mobility hub, and it would be a place where maybe there's bicycle repair that's going on, maybe some of those new electric scooters would be available, maybe it's a place where you can refill your bus pass, maybe you have access to different kinds of safety classes or things like that, kind of like a community center where it's like a one-stop shop for all your transportation needs. um, or whatever else people can think of. We just need to be coming up with ways to spend our public dollars in our neighborhoods on transportation in a way that doesn't just have to do with investing in the built environment, because that model, not only is that putting money, basically saying the money can only go to this kind of professional contracting firm, it's also, we know, a big part of the gentrification pattern, that
Yes.
in neighborhoods where there was not good upkeep of public spaces and infrastructure for a long time, if you start putting money into those things, hey, guess what? It's part of the turnover that's going to be happening. So like, only human beings could come up with something so contradictory. It's like riding a bicycle and walking. Those are like the cheapest ways you can get around. Like, you don't have to feed your bicycle, you just have to feed your body.
No.
Walking, if you're able-bodied, it's just using your own 2 feet. And yet, because of our messed up society, those ways of getting around are seen as like privileged. They could be associated with like wealthy people. If you want to live close enough to your job to walk to work, well, you better have, some money at this point in
Right.
time. So,
Because, like, really what you're hitting on is the allocation of transportation funds, which generally, as you mentioned, go to more middle class tastes and not so much catering to or concerned with those who actually rely on public transportation to get back and forth to work,
mhm,
or wherever else they need to get and back and forth from and to.
mhm.
So what is your opinion about, a couple things? First, what is your perspective or opinion on this overall image that biking for white middle class taste is somehow seen as better, or something that is more of the image that we see, in contrast with a black or brown person on a bicycle? Like, what I mean, I know the answer, but like, what, like, what is it? What, duh. But like, what is that? Like, why is it that
Yeah,
that's the
yeah.
image?
Well, you know what? That's a really old image. Like that, it's an enduring image because it was very real at one point. Okay, so the bicycle, I guess I didn't really know all this until I started studying bicycling academically, but it was invented not that long ago. Like basically there were a number of different bicycle, like two-wheeled or three-wheeled designs that people were working on in the 19th century, and then wasn't till about the 1870s that we got to the bicycle that would be familiar to us now, which is called a safety bicycle. And so when it first became available, this thing was like it was like the Tesla of its day, but even like more revolutionary because prior to that, the only way you could get around was on a horse, um, in a carriage that was being pulled by a horse, in a locomotive. They had that kind of technology. There was no personal mobility device that didn't involve, some kind of animal power. And so the bicycle was like, it allowed people to be traveling around at a higher speed than they'd ever done before, on this little device. And it led them to, want to get out of town, have places to go, all these kinds of things. But the people who could afford these fancy new machines were wealthy white people. So the first people biking around in cities were these rich white guys, and they did not have a great attitude. There's a lot of like media stories from the end of the 19th century about these really rude bicyclists who would, be like ringing their bells and shouting and cutting people off, and they were seen as this kind of urban menace. But again, the people who could be buying these machines were really privileged people who didn't have, probably the the best sense of
Move, peasant.
camaraderie. Yeah, exactly,
Yeah.
with working people. And so it was also, seen as totally for whites only. So the League of American Bicyclists, the organization I used to work for, when they first started, they were called the League of American Wheelmen, and their membership voted multiple times about whether to bar black people from being members, and they actually passed that. I think it was in 1894. They said nope, can't be a member of the League of American Wheelmen if you're black. And
Wow.
so the segregation, the legal segregation that was typical of that era, it happened in transportation spaces. Like actually, um, Plessy v. Ferguson, the really landmark Supreme Court case that codified legal segregation, had to do with a train, and who was sitting in which car on a train. And so, I think, and then, fast forward to the civil rights era and the whole issue of where people were allowed to be riding on buses and the Montgomery bus boycott and Rosa Parks. I mean, transportation and racial segregation are need to be in the same story because as we do these innovations in transportation, um, if you have a racist society like we do, then the people who are the second class aren't supposed to have access to the new technologies. They're not supposed to
Right.
have access to the best. They're not supposed to have access to the first class. And so that was the case with bicycles. So when I was doing research, when I worked in DC, I found some images from the 1890s that were like a comic series called Dark Town Bicycling. So there was this whole like Dark Town comic series that was blackface. It was like those caricatures where people have the like giant lips and
Yeah.
um,
Yes. Yes.
yeah. So the joke of this series was, how could these uppity Negroes think that they could ride bicycles. So it was like images of people, in blackface on bicycles and speaking broken English and just like, it was really disgusting. When I found that, I was like, oh my gosh. But there you go. So this image
Mm-hmm.
of, bicycling is for privileged white people, that is the original image of bicycling. It's nothing new, and it should be, no surprise that we still have it. But what should really be uplifted is alongside that frickin' image, there's also a very long history of um, not only people of color using bicycles, but people of color doing some pretty amazing stuff with bicycles. Like
Hmm.
the best. So back when bicycles were, cool and a new thing and exciting, it was, common to have people go to bicycle races as a spectator sport,
Hmm.
which is hard to imagine now. I know it's like, what?
Yeah.
You
It's
don't
like,
go to like a
what?
stadium to see a bicycle race, but people were
No.
totally doing that back in the 1890s. And the best, like by far, the best bicycle racer was a black man named
Whoop.
Marshall or Major Taylor. Yeah, he was the best, like beat everybody. And he was so good that even the League of American Wheelmen like lifted their racist policy and said, "Oh, you can be a member." And he has such an interesting life story. I really recommend learning more about Major Taylor. And he has been, it's one of those things where he was forgotten for many decades, and then his legacy has been an inspiration to Black and multiracial bicycle clubs all over the country. So there's a whole network of Major Taylor clubs and different clubs who, get together. There's a coalition called the National Brotherhood of Cyclists that isn't always too active. I don't know when they're having their next national conference, but it's a national league of Black and multiracial cycling clubs, and so there's a lot of people who are uh, strongly like in favor of recognizing that even though we've had that white privileged bicyclist image forever, guess what? We've also had these role models and these figures who have broken through barriers and shown that this technology is not just available for um, the people at the top of the heap. So nowadays, oh my gosh, there's so many great like media oriented projects out there. Like Black Girls Do Bike is a club that has chapters in cities all over the country. Um, in the DC area, there's Black Women Bike DC, which does community rides for women. There is Red Bike and Green, which is a Black community ride that started in Oakland, was started by a Black woman, Jenna Burton, I think back in 2006, and then they started up chapters in different cities. And Red Bike and Green is specifically focused on uplifting the story of Black power in Black neighborhoods in U.S. cities. And so it's a community ride that specifically for Black folks, and tells the story of what's going on in different neighborhoods.
I don't think I've heard of Major Taylor, and that's a problem. And I know personally,
Right.
that the image that I generally see around of people riding bikes, or the people who are always advocating for more bike lanes and things like that, are usually white. And they're not the only ones I see, of course, but those are the ones predominantly getting the attention. So we've kind of we've already been there, but we're in the crossroads where this is the segment where I really like to kind of bring everything together. So, but we've already kind of been discussing it. So we've talked about how mobility justice really ties into race and class. also hinted at, the impacts of using more bicycles, using more public transportation as a means to help to combat climate change, reducing our individual and collective carbon footprint. So we've hit those. But what can people do locally in their communities if they, whatever they might need, if they want to have access to additional bike lanes, if they want to advocate for, just a thought, mobile medical buses so that trans women can have, so that
I like it.
so that trans women can, or sex workers, anyone can feel safe if they're out and working and also need somewhere to go afterwards, or during, or not, maybe not during, but like afterwards, after the shift is over. What can people do individually, and also maybe if they're looking for, you've named some groups already, but what can people do advocacy wise to kind of bring awareness to the need for additional public transportation or bikes?
Great.
Anything.
Yeah, absolutely. There are, it's tricky with the mobility justice conversation. We are still, seeing that there's so much bridge building to be done, because transportation is just not an area that has gotten as much attention from our different racial, social, economic justice oriented movements. And you know what? It's because people are trying to put food on the table. People are trying to keep shelter over their children's heads. And so the transportation piece, is kind of, in some ways it's seen as like icing on the cake. So especially, talking about something like bicycling. So what we're working towards is figuring out the right way to support the ongoing efforts that are out there to be making sure our communities are taken care of. And so, even though in a lot of cities there are like bicycle coalitions or groups that do advocacy around trying to get more funding for infrastructure, I would say actually it's probably a better bet to like try to make the case with whatever organization is like showing up for the community. How are they talking about transportation? How are they talking about mobility? In some cities, there are bus rider unions or transit rider unions where people get together and come up with advocacy strategies that are really about serving the people who are using public transportation today. Usually they have a really good analysis of making sure that the investment we're making in the future supports the people who are, already making those choices today. But yeah, I mean, and even just noticing, like in your neighborhood, is there like an old guy who fixes up bikes in his garage? Are there neighbors who give each other rides? Are there, like moms who walk a few sets of kids to school? Like, how are people already helping each other out and making choices that are more sustainable in ways that don't necessarily match the glitzy, high-tech, zero emissions mobility future that we are hearing about, but actually have to do with our communities being resilient and supporting each other. So yeah, I would say look for the examples that are already around you, and bring those stories to whatever local group is working on environmental justice or housing justice, and see how to connect those dots so that when there is funding available for transportation, it is getting directed into the same kinds of efforts that are already out there to make sure people can remain in their neighborhoods and be thriving.
And then, something to kind of build up that too is, learn when your local legislative sessions are, keep pulse on that, because even though nationally, we're kind of screwed. There's still just a hair screwed. So there may be things that people can do and we can do locally. So learn when your state and local representatives go into session. Learn who they are. Like, get to know them. Some of them, they're all right, and they will talk to you. They will listen to you. And you can tell them what you would like to see, and they can take that with them, when they go to obviously when they go into session. So just to kind of piggyback and build off that. And last but not least, talk about your book.
Right. So I have this book
Whoop, whoop.
that yeah. It's kind of a big deal for me. Let's see. Okay, so it's called Bicycle slash Race, Transportation Culture and Resistance. And I wrote a memoir about both my dissertation research, getting my anthropology PhD, and then the advocacy work I did at the national level around bike equity. And it came out from Microcosm Publishing in 2018, and it has been a really, given me the opportunity to speak with a lot of folks around the country who are looking for ways to expand what has been in their scope around creating safer streets, creating sustainable mobility cultures that are inclusive and welcoming, building on the assets that we already have around uh, culturally relevant public spaces. So yeah, it's available through the publisher Microcosm. It's also available at like boutique bookstores. It is also available places like Amazon.
Okay.
But if you look in the publishing information inside the book, like the inside cover, the publisher kind of scolds people for using Amazon, which I think is funny.
I'm trying. I know we're not
Yeah.
supposed to give Jeff Bezos not any more of our coins, but all right. Okay.
You
2 day
know, we
shipping.
yeah, we're caught
Okay.
up. We're caught up in a system,
I know. I
Rashida. It's
know.
the individual choices are not the whole
I
picture. But
know.
yeah, the book is out there, and I'm always happy to talk about it. And um, I have really had the pleasure of getting a lot of great feedback from folks, and um, who are finding things written in the book that they have thought. And I love it when I get the response from people of, oh my gosh, you said what I was thinking, but I'd never heard anybody say that before. So to me, that's a confirmation that I'm contributing to um, making it possible for more people to get their stories out there
Yeah.
by telling my own.
Mm-hmm.
So it's been a good experience.
So how can people find you if they want to connect with you, if they want to just get in contact with you or just keep up with what you're doing?
Well, I'm all freaking over the place. So I have a website, urbanadonia.com, because I used to have a blog and it was called Urban Adonia, but I'm too busy to be blogging anymore. Plus, does anybody blog
I want
anymore?
to
I guess
get
you're,
back into it, but I'm
yeah. I
really
mean, it's
busy.
good to journal and write. I mean, that's a good practice. But anyway, so urbanadonia.com. I also can be reached through Antioch University, Los Angeles, where I'm the chair of the Urban Sustainability Master's Program. Um,
Yes.
woo! And I also can be found through People for Mobility Justice, based in Los Angeles, where I'm an advisory board co-chair. Through untokening.org, I'm a core organizer of that. Um, and I don't know if I told you, Rashida, I'm also now the board president for a community land trust here in
No,
LA.
no,
So
you didn't. Oh my
yeah,
gosh.
some learning about that side of the equation, the whole land use and housing piece. So we can talk about that
Oh
more later.
yeah. We are definitely going to have a conversation about that because that is news to me and I like it. Adonia, thank you. Thank you so much for joining me. This was a great conversation. I really would love to have you to come back, even if we talk about the land trust piece or if we talk more about mobility justice. Either way, I just thank you so much. This has been very informative. I find that every time that you and I have conversations, I always come away with something. And I just appreciate that about you. So I wanted
Hmm.
to
Well, you're welcome and
yes.
thank you. Yeah, I am so happy to be on my favorite podcast. Thanks for the opportunity,
You
Rashida.
are so welcome. And thank you again. And we'll talk soon. Thank you for joining me. And thank you to Adonia for the great conversation. If you're interested in joining a cycling club, visit blackcyclingclubs.com. They have an active list of cycling groups by state. I also encourage everyone to take account of your community and the infrastructure that's available for cycling. Utilizing public transportation or bike lanes reduces our individual and collective carbon footprint. If your community lacks adequate modes of transportation or infrastructure, I encourage you to get in touch with your local representatives. The issue with any development work is the working class population is often overlooked in the planning process. Meetings are scheduled at inopportune times and dates, or major planning is done before public meetings are held. By the time you see notices or cranes, it's often too late. Decisions about how your community should look and what needs exist are being made by developers to suit middle class tastes. On the next episode, we're talking about medical marijuana and how one organization is bringing knowledge and resources to Florida and beyond. See you then.